Former DA leader Tony Leon has been bashed on social media for his comments on Mmusi Maimane. He labeled the official opposition's first black leader as an experiment gone wrong. Leon, in his new book, claims that South Africa is being held back by the ANC's apparent obsession with race. To speak to us about whether South Africans are in denial about racial politics, we're joined by social analyst and political commentator Tessa Dooms. Also joining the conversation are political analysts Professor Sipho Siepe and Sanusha Naidu. Good evening to you all, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Tessa, I'll begin with you. Are South Africans in denial when it comes to race politics?
Absolutely not. And particularly young South Africans, because they have to deal with the fallout of structural racism on a daily basis. When they're trying to look for jobs, when they're planning their economic futures, when they're thinking about the disparities in service delivery between the areas that they live in and the areas that are dominated by other racial groups, they are confronted with race and racism every day of their lives. So for them, race matters. For all of us in this country, if we're paying enough attention, we understand that the legacy of apartheid is not just something that's happening in theory, it's something that's practically a part of our lives and practically part of the way we relate with one another, and it's not just some incident that happens on the side somewhere. And so any political party that is thinking that we're in a post-race society as South Africans doesn't know the country that they're operating in.
And listening to that, Professor Siepe, if I bring you into this conversation, I mean, listening to what Tessa's just said, and then you think back to, you know, the DA's stance on non-racialism, is this then something that remains an ideal, or is it really something that is attainable?
Well, first of all, when you look at parties, you must look at their interest. The DA's point of departure is about protection of white privilege and white interest. And if you take Tony Leon's very comment of saying Maimane is an experiment gone wrong, if Maimane was white, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And Tony Leon would not be talking about a certain individual who's white being an experiment. It will be a question of one leader followed by another leader, etc. The issue of experiment will not come in. So his very language puts race on the table. That here you have, and when you talk about an experiment, you're talking about a scientific procedure undertaken to achieve or to discover something. So the likes of Tony Leon still talk about a certain discovery about whether black people are competent. So one cannot run away from that issue. But the issue of race is very central in this country. Whether you're talking about the commerce, you talk about the politics, you talk about the geography, the race confronts you. In this country, the people who are poor are black. So blackness carries the weight of the burden of poverty. You're talking about people who are landless, they are black. You're talking about people who are unemployed and unemployed, you're talking about black. So there is no way that you could run away from the legacy of apartheid that confronts us every day. But what we've also seen is a commitment, as Tessa put it, when you talk about structural racism. You're talking about a situation where even today we continue to reproduce the legacy of apartheid. If we look at the new settlements that we have, it's again black people being in the periphery of the economy. You look at the issue of access to the best schools, it's still written in race. So you can't run away from race. And if you talk about exclusion of black people in key positions, you're talking about race. So race confronts us, and we need to talk about it honestly. But the point of departure for me is whose interest does Tony represent, and whose interest does the DA represent? And if you bring that in, you will discover that even some of the white folks in the ANC, they still have to deal with the issue of their own racism. Some of it, they may not even be aware of it. So we need to talk about structural racism, but we must also talk about racism at the interpersonal relationships. You talk about the crisis in historically white universities. It boils down to issue of race. So you can't run away from the issue of race. And the problem is, we wanted South Africa to succeed, and we thought we could simply jump without addressing the horrible legacy of over 300 years where race was a determinant of South African life.
And I'd like to bring you in, Sanusha, here at the back of that very statement. Some have said on social media that, South Africa appears to be a race-sensitive, country. Others are saying there's a reading of too much into what, Tony Leon had to say about Mmusi Maimane, and it should just be taken at face value. What do you make of those statements?
Good evening to you and the viewers. I think you cannot ignore the fact that race is a really important, if not sensitive, issue in our political, economic, social, cultural landscape. You can't just kind of, sweep it under the carpet or try and just say, let's move on from this issue, because it's at the heart of the very issue of transformation and what transformation means. It's about inclusion of people who have, as both Tessa and Prof have mentioned, have been at the periphery of our economy, of our social cohesion, of inclusion in terms of our universities. You just got to look at these structural issues and realize that you're never going to basically level the playing field and say that now we have to talk about a post-racial society in South Africa, because intergenerational inequality is so vivid and so much part of the psyche of people's everyday experiences, their livelihoods, their lives. I mean, you take the student protest, and it's about inclusion, but it's also about the financial inclusion of what's happening at the universities. And when you look at these protesting students, you have to remember they're looking at their parents, and they're looking at how their parents' lived experiences has always been about exclusion, haven't been able to level the playing field, and it's not an easy thing to do. So I think whilst there may be those groups in society that feel that we need to move on, that we need to basically start thinking about a society where everything is equal, I think you can't do that, because at the end of the day, the conversations we're having about race is really at the heart of what is going to happen to South Africa in the next 25 years. The youth of this country, the protesting students are all at the heart of this engine of our economic development. But if they're not included, then it's going to be really, really difficult to talk about certain groups that will basically be more advantaged than others. And I think it's very important that we have to recognize that this conversation, and Prof would remember that we've been talking about this, I think, since the 1990s, Prof, where we've been having the same conversation about race. We've been talking about it, and we've tried particular avenues to deal with the transformation agenda. It hasn't worked because certain elements of the structural racism that Tessa referred to hasn't been resolved. And so we're coming back to the very same issues. And I think the point that I also want to make here is the question of when we have those in society that feel that we need to move on, are they also dealing with their cancelled culture as well? How are they dealing with their kind of engagement around what is it that they see as their responsibility and at times their culpability around this kind of racial debates that we are having? So I don't think you can ignore it, and I don't think we should ignore it, because if we do it at our peril, and we're not really creating a society of inclusion. If you think about the works of Frantz Fanon and looking at how he spoke about the decolonization debates, you look at Edward Said and the question of this romanticization of a life in the Middle East, the Orientalism, but it doesn't really transform. And it's a global debate as well, because at the end of the day, we're also dealing with global narratives of racism, of race, and more importantly, of whose culture, whose racism are we considering as acceptable, and whose that we don't consider as acceptable.
And Tessa, some scholars say that politicians or governments should not be using the race classification, but should rather be looking at poverty as a measure to be able to bring those that need to be brought a level up. Do you agree with those statements?
So the reasons why we still use race in our context is because the link between race and economic exclusion, poverty, is a real one, is historical. And when we talk about redress in this country, the apartheid system very closely linked class and race, and intentionally so. And so if you're going to try and redress that link between class and race, you have to acknowledge race. We can talk about a post-racial society and a society where race doesn't matter when race doesn't matter. For now, it does. And example after example can be brought up where we see that the only difference between somebody who's rich, somebody who's poor, is the fact that they come from a particular lineage, that they have a particular political position of blackness. And you can't just walk away from that. You can't exclude that. You can't pretend like that doesn't exist. If you think about an example like Nazi Germany, if we had to start pretending that the reason why the Nazis chose a particular group of people was because they were Jewish and they had particular characteristics and they had particular social stigma that was placed on those characteristics, then you start to reimagine history. You start to reimagine the reasons why things happen. And the way that you start to redress something is when you go to the cause. The root cause is that we have a society where race has been used as a marker and a way to disenfranchise some people, to make some people less human than others, to make some people less worthy of dignity, respect, opportunity than others. And that was a mechanism in colonization to dispossess. I could dispossess somebody else because I did not think of them as fully human. I did not think of them as my equal, and so they didn't matter. Their oppression didn't matter. Their rights didn't matter. That's the genesis of racism, is to use it as a way to advance class positions. So if we try and to de-link the two in the African context, we are rewriting history and we are not getting to the root cause of the problem that we need to fix in this country very badly.
And unfortunately, I'm told I'm almost out of time. Prof, I'd like to give you, this question, particularly in just 10 seconds. Would you say that South Africans have been given enough reason to believe that they are South African and not see color?
No, I think when we talk about the redress, we should be able to measure it. And we're going to measure it on the basis of how many black people are taken out of poverty, how many black people run the economy, how many people are in ministerial positions, how many black people feel the sense of inclusion. And the problem with Maimane is that why Tony Leon says he is an experiment that has gone wrong is simply because Maimane will from time to time remember that he's African. So in terms of whiteness, Maimane had to pretend that he is no longer black. But unfortunately, reality always confronts you. This is why some of his speeches were talking about the issues of opportunity. So he was bringing the issue of race again on the table. You remember Lindiwe Masibuko, it is her problem and her sin was also to deal with these issues of affirmative action, black empowerment, etc., where they did not want to deal with that. So we cannot run away from that, and I think we should put it on the table, including the use of language. It is black people who carry the burden of always having to learn other people's language. They don't think that they have a responsibility to learn our languages because they still believe in white supremacy. And we need to start moving in that direction, that when we start telling our kids that they must only learn English, Afrikaans, and white people don't learn anything, we're also sending a subliminal message that black people don't count. And the black lives do matter, and they matter culturally, linguistically, and economically.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight, but certainly this discussion does not stop here. I do hope that we can have this discussion again very soon. That was social analyst and political commentator Tessa Dooms and political analyst Professor Sipho Siepe, as well as Sanusha Naidu.